was in 1973 when 23-year-old Althea Dale Blankenship and her 4-year-old son, Jeffrey, moved to Port Townsend, close to the Puget Sound in Washington. Althea had spent her early life in Virginia before moving to Washington with her family. She graduated from Shoreline High School, Washington in 1967, and 2 years later, her son Jeffrey was born. Althea had set her sights on creating a better life for the pair. Contemporary news articles do not mention whether Jeffrey's father was in the picture, and it appears he has never been named publicly. After spending a few years in Shoreline, Althea decided to move 50 miles to Port Townsend, Washington. Althea's parents, Oscar and Mary Marks, owned a home in Port Townsend, and she wanted herself and her son to be closer to her parents. The move was a breath of fresh air for the two, and they rented a room from Glenn Allen Bagley. According to local news reports, Althea and Glenn developed a romantic interest in one another. Unfortunately, little is known about Althea's time in Port Townsend. We do know that at the time, Glenn Bagley was separated from his wife Esther Mae Jessler. Just 3 years after Althea and Jeffrey were last seen, Esther too would disappear. She was last seen in Auburn, Washington on March 13, 1976, leaving home in her blue Mercury station wagon. By 1976, Esther had remarried and was training to become a paralegal. On the day that Esther disappeared, she told her second husband that she was going to rent a hotel room so she could be alone to study. While the disappearance of Esther and Althea have never been officially connected, it is hard to ignore the striking similarities. Althea and her son Jeffrey were last seen on March 27, 1973, at or close to the apartment that they shared with Glenn Bagley. Before we proceed, I've got an exciting surprise for you. We've launched a brand new channel dedicated to intriguing content such as old historical mysteries, cold cases, and particularly chilling horror stories perfect for bedtime. Drop a comment letting us know if you're a fan of horror stories or not. You can find the link in the description below. Let's find out who will be the first to explore it. Alright, let's dive back into the video. That day, Althea and Jeffrey were due to travel to the Seattle-Tacoma International Airport. From there, they had plans to fly to New York City and catch a connecting flight to Greece to meet up with Althea's parents, who were already holidaying there. Unfortunately, Althea and Jeffrey never made it to their flights and have never been seen or heard from again. Glenn is believed to be the last person to have seen the pair alive. He told the Kent Police Department that on March 27th, he dropped Althea and Jeffrey off at the Seattle-Tacoma International Airport, which was the last time he saw them. Investigators doubted his story, but without solid evidence, they were unable to move forward with the conviction. While searching Althea's room, they uncovered letters between the two that exposed their romantic relationship, which had previously been unknown. Following the 1976 disappearance of Esther, authorities ramped up their investigation of him. Glenn soon caught wind of the police attention that he'd garnered and had moved to the Philippines to escape the heat. Glenn Allen Bagley never returned to the United States, passing away in 2016 from cancer. According to the Charlie Project, the Kent Police Department tried to build a case against him for many years, but were always unsuccessful. An ex-girlfriend of Bagley later told investigators that he had not been building a cat house on the day of Esther's disappearance as he had told law enforcement. She refused to tell the police anything else as Glenn had threatened her, telling her, quote, "You will end up in the same culvert in Kinsing as Esther." Searches for Althea, Jeffrey, and Esther have been conducted, but nothing has been found so far. In 1973, burned and charred human remains were discovered on Protection Island, just off of Discovery Bay. Unfortunately, the chain of custody is somewhat murky on these remains, with the Port Townsend leader reporting, the remains pulled from the island burn pile in 1973 were transferred to the University of Washington's anthropology lab. It was concluded that the University of Washington had no documentation of those remains, nor several other associated records from that era. Althea Dale Blankenship is described as a Caucasian female with brown hair, blue eyes, 5 feet 7 inches, and 135 to 140 pounds. Jeffrey Dean Blankenship was described as a white male with brown hair, brown eyes, 3 feet 5 inches, and 75 pounds. Anyone with information is asked to contact Detective John Thompson of the Kent Police. What are your thoughts about this case? Let us know in the comment section down below. It was on September 29, 1980, approximately 5 miles from Ashland, Virginia, at around 6:30 p.m. when firefighters were attempting to put out a brush fire when they came across the burned remains of a young woman. She was found on a gravel dirt road that would be later named Wesley's Court, just off of what is now Greenwood Church Road, approximately 12 minutes outside of Ashland. The woman was able to be identified quickly through dental records. She was Patricia Eve Gagler. Not much is known about the young woman, but she was 28 years old. She was moving from her hometown in Pottstown, Pennsylvania to live with her brother in Richmond, Virginia. Authorities would discover that she had last been seen on September 29th, around 3 p.m. at a Sunoco gas station in Ashland, Virginia. News reports from 1980 stated that she'd been there to get a used car tire. They would also discover her vehicle on the dirt road near the fire. An autopsy was performed and the medical examiner stated that Patricia had died from an upper airways burns due to immolation or death by fire. They said that she had most likely died within seconds of her airways being burned. They also stated that they didn't find any other wounds on her body, as well as no evidence of sexual assault. They could not determine if she had been conscious at the time of her death, and her death was ultimately ruled a homicide. There has been no speculation that the killer had started the fire or it had already been started and just utilized. No suspect has ever been reported to the public. There's no record that Patricia had been married at any point in her life. Her last known occupation had been stated as a waitress on her death certificate. Both of her parents passed away in 2010 and 2012, and they never got to know what happened to their daughter. Patricia was last seen at that gas station, and she'd only been about 30 minutes from Richmond, Virginia. Law enforcement has always been stumped on why she'd been on that road going in the wrong direction when she was last seen on the main road to Richmond. Authorities have never released much about this case, and details for this are significantly lacking. In January 2022, deputies from the Hanover County Sheriff's Department asked the public to come forward with any information regarding the case of Patricia E. Gagler. What are your thoughts about this case? Let us know in the comment section down below. 30-year-old Sheila Sue Connor was described as a loving and caring mother to her 8-year-old son David. Sheila's life hadn't always been easy, with her son telling local news outlets that she'd been subjected to violence from a young age. Despite her challenging beginnings, Sheila was a kind and gentle soul who ensured her son would never have to face the same hardships she did. The two lived together in Houston, Texas, and things were going well for a while. That was until December 31st, 1991. David's only memory of that day was being pulled out of the bath and being told to dry off and put on some clothes as quickly as possible. Houston police officers crouched to his level and told him the devastating news. His beloved mother was missing. At 8 years old, this was hard for David to comprehend, and it took several years for him to be able to process that day entirely. According to reports, Sheila was last seen at Echo Glen Lane at the home of her boyfriend. The man with whom Sheila was in a relationship was much older than her, and her friends and family worried for her safety. Sheila was considerably more vulnerable as she was battling with addiction at the time of her disappearance. The last known contact from Sheila Connor came at 3:30 a.m. when she called a friend from her boyfriend's home in North Houston. She told a friend that she and him had gotten into an argument, and that was the last time anyone ever heard from Sheila. She was reported missing days later. When her missing person investigation began, her car was found abandoned and stripped down along Interstate 45 in New Haven, Texas. Sheila's boyfriend has never been publicly named, but David Connor believes his mother was murdered that night. David now works with the media to ensure his mother's name and story has never been forgotten. Sheila Sue Connor is described as a white female with brown hair, brown eyes, 5 foot, and 130 pounds. She has a scar on the right side of her chin and the following tattoos: a leaf on her left leg, a rose on her right breast, and a tattoo on her arm. She was last seen wearing a black jacket, blue jeans, and maybe wearing glasses. Her son is still hopeful that someone with information will come forward and he can finally have some answers. What are your thoughts about this case? Let us know in the comment section down below. March 30th, 1980 marked a dark day in the history books Lake Erie, Ohio. That morning, the Sandusky police responded to a call about a bizarre object floating at the lake's edge. As they approached Cedar Point, officers realized the gravity of the situation. Backup was requested and the area was cordoned off from nosy residents. Unfortunately, there's limited information about the discovery. According to the Detroit Free Press, the Sandusky Police Department found the body of a young woman. She was aged 20 to 30. She was 5 feet 5 inches and 120 pounds, wearing what they described as a disco-style dress slumped at the edge of Lake Erie. The discovery rocked the community and investigators immediately set about identifying their victim. Unfortunately, this initial piece of the investigation would never come to be. Sandusky police did not release the woman's manner of death, which remains a point of contention. An autopsy revealed that the woman had several broken bones. Her femur, pelvis, and jaw were all shattered. However, the medical examiner couldn't be sure if the injuries had happened pre- or post-mortem. Several press releases and conferences were held, but nobody recognized the young woman in the size 12 disco dress. The case immediately went stale. There were no scars, jewelry pieces, or other identifying features on her body. In time, the woman was buried as the Erie County Jane Doe. There was no date of birth to adorn her grave, just March 30th, 1980. The Sandusky Police Department never gave up on the Erie County Jane Doe, but with limited evidence and resources, the case could not progress. It would take decades for the name Erie County Jane Doe to appear in the media again, but there was good news this time. In late 2021, the Porchlight Project, a nonprofit organization that helps to fund the solving of cold cases, announced that they would be willing to pay for the new DNA testing in the Erie County Jane Doe case. By 2021, genetic genealogy was beginning to peak, and the Sandusky Police Department believed this may be their only chance to close this case once and for all. Shortly after accepting the donation, the woman's remains were sent to Bode Technology in Virginia for further testing. DNA analysis. Unfortunately, this kind of testing isn't instantaneous. Technicians worked exceedingly hard to research, prepare, and test samples for years. Almost 2 years later, in March 2023, Sandusky Police Department and the Porchlight Project announced that the Erie County Jane Doe had been identified as 31-year-old Patricia Eleanor Greenwood. The announcement came on March 30th, 43 years to the day since she was discovered. Analysis found Patricia after discovering that she was one of 12 children who had been given up for adoption. Patricia was born in 1948 in Michigan and has lived in Traverse City, Bay City, and Saginaw. Patricia was never reported missing, and her siblings last saw her in 1979. The Sandusky Police Department is still working on Patricia's cold case, and while she has been identified, it's anything but closed. According to Patricia's sister, she may have been a sex worker at the time of her death, and the Sandusky Police Department believe that Patricia met with foul play. Unfortunately, no one in her family had a photograph of Patricia, and law enforcement is hoping to find anyone who knew her to come forward, as they'd like to get a better picture of what her life was like. Hopefully, with that information, they can be one step closer to finding her killer. Nick Edwards, a board member for Project Porchlight, gave this statement to the media regarding Patricia's case. Quote, "Being able to give Patricia Greenwood her name back is the first step in finding the justice that she deserves. Thank you to the brilliant folks at Vode for the wonderful work that they do. Vode continues to impress, and their assistance to those in law enforcement is making it more difficult for bad people to get away with bad things." The Sandusky Police Department never gave up on this victim, even after all these years. Now it's time for the public to come together and provide information about Patricia Greenwood to the detectives. Patricia needs your help. What are your thoughts about this case? Let us know in the comments section down below. It was on February 16, 1986, when hikers along the Pacific Crest Trail made a grisly discovery at the Los Coyotes Indian Reservation. The partially decomposed body of a woman lay at the edge of the campsite. San Diego County Sheriff's Office was immediately dispatched to the scene and began their investigation. Moments later, the San Diego County Sheriff's Office received a call that would change everything. 14 miles from where the female victim was, there was found a man in a similar condition. Both victims were wearing thick jackets and layers of clothing. The similarities were too apparent to ignore, and investigators knew they had to identify both bodies before their killer could be identified. Law enforcement has withheld a lot of information in both of these cases. The manner of death of the man found 14 miles away has never been released to preserve the investigation's integrity. Detectives struggled to make any headway in either case. There was very little evidence, and the evidence the SDCSO did have was being withheld from the media. Her murder floated through the media for a few weeks before interest fizzled out. For decades, her case would go untouched, but the San Diego County Sheriff's Office knew there was family out there looking for their loved one. In 2023, the San Diego County Sheriff's Office turned to genetic genealogy. A sample of the woman's hair was submitted for analysis on websites such as 23andMe and GeneMatch. According to CBS, quote, using this DNA analysis, as well as census records and other public information, detectives were able to build family trees and track down relatives. Investigators had now identified the family tree, and all they had to do was find the missing link. Shortly after her DNA was submitted, law enforcement identified the Jane Doe as Claudette Jean Zabulski Powers. The mother of two would have been 24 years old when she was brutally murdered. Detectives pieced together what they knew of her life before she disappeared. In the early 1980s, Claudette left her Michigan home and moved to Washington with her husband. By 1983, Claudette filed for divorce and found a property in San Diego County for herself and her daughters. However, in 1984, tragedy struck the Powers family when their patriarch passed away. Upon losing her father, Claudette felt lost. Her siblings recalled to officers that September 1984 was the last time they saw or spoke to their beloved sister at their father's funeral. After that, she dropped off the map. Her siblings hired a private investigator, but there is no sign. Her siblings and family loved Claudette, and they knew her disappearance was out of the ordinary. However, she was never reported missing formally, and her family had no idea that she'd been deceased all these years. Whilst Claudette has now been identified, investigators still have a long way to go in this investigation. They are now tasked with piecing Claudette's life together from September 1984 to 1986. There are some reports that she worked as a waitress in Escondido, and anyone with information or may have known Claudette is asked to come forward. Her sister said in a statement to the media, quote, "It's been really hard on our family. Someone knows what happened. A neighbor, anyone that knew her knows what happened. If you're still alive and you knew my sister and you knew what happened to her, please come forward. Please, we need closure." San Diego County Sheriff's Office has not released the manners of the death for Claudette or the John Doe, and the investigation is ongoing. What they have said is that they are looking for a male suspect, and that Claudette had suffered a violent death. They are hoping to identify the man who had been murdered. As well, they said that the man is a similar age to Claudette, mid-20s, and that they were both similarly dressed in thermals and clothing suitable for camping. They had both been deceased for approximately 2 weeks before their bodies were discovered. No other personal effects were found, and no camping gear, bags, or purses. The area was remote, and they would have needed a vehicle to get there. At this time, there are no sketches of John Doe available, nor much information that might help identify him. What are your thoughts about this case? Let us know in the comment section down below. On October 26, 1976, the Palm Beach County Sheriff's Department were called to the Talisman Sugar Farm in Palm Beach County, Florida. This case would be like no other, sending investigators on an ever-twisting turning path. In the cane field lay the body of a man who was later believed to be white or Native American. His remains were somewhat skeletonized, and that he had been exposed to the ailments for at least 2 months before his discovery. Forensic experts deemed his death a homicide with the gunshot wound to the back of his skull as the cause of death. He had a unique Timex watch with the initials LJ carved on the inside. Investigators also discovered that Palm Beach County John Doe had been shot 3 times overall. Over the years, several forensic photography experts have created several renditions of what he may have looked like in life, but these failed to produce any leads. In 2022, the nonprofit organization joined forces with the Palm Beach County Sheriff's Office. Their press release from Orthram states, quote, "This case was entered into Name Us as Up 1300. The Palm Beach County Sheriff's Office sent skeletal remains for the unidentified homicide victim to Orthram. After many months of hard work, the Palm Beach County Sheriff's Office announced that the 29-year-old Douglas Lindstreeter. In April 1976, Douglas and a group of friends traveled from his hometown of Bryan, Ohio to Florida on a boys' trip in March 1976. According to Douglas' friends, he was last seen in the vicinity of the Spanish Oaks Apartments in Boca Raton, Florida in April 1976. He went by the nickname Strut. From Florida, it seems he became separated from his friends and disappeared. His friends returned home without him. His estimated time of death was around August, but he disappeared in April. No one knows what he'd been doing in the months between his disappearance and murder. What are your thoughts about this case? Let us know in the comment section down below. Before we proceed, I've got an exciting surprise for you. We've launched a brand new channel dedicated to intriguing content such as old historical mysteries, cold cases, and particularly chilling horror stories perfect for bedtime. Drop a comment letting us know if you're a fan of horror stories or not. You can find the link in the description below. Let's find out who will be the first to explore it. Alright, let's dive back into the video. In early May 2010, a man walked up to a couple of unhoused men in Santa Monica, California. He offered the men $1,000 to split if they'd kill someone for him. One of the unhoused men, who went by Big Dave, said he was uncomfortable killing in public. The man with the money offered to come back later and show him how to get into his house. After Big Dave went to his police liaison officer and told them what the man had planned, law enforcement would set up a sting operation, and Big Dave agreed to wear a wire for the event. They would discover that this man was Juan Carlos Cruz, a Food Network celebrity chef with the show Calorie Commando. Juan Carlos Cruz moved to the United States when he was 3 years old with his family from the Dominican Republic. He reported being fascinated with cooking his whole life. He went to culinary school in California with a focus on pastry. After graduating, he got a job as the salt pastry chef at the Hotel Bel Air. He made pastries for famous stars like Oprah, Jack Nicholson, and Julia Roberts before landing himself in TV. He was married to his high school sweetheart, Jennifer Campbell. Law enforcement quickly discovered that it was his beloved wife Jennifer who had been the intended target of the hit. On May 12th, Cruz would take Big Dave to his apartment and show him how to get in undetected. He gave him the code to the security system, and he told Big Dave to slit Jennifer's throat, but later changed his mind to strangulation, so there wouldn't be much of a mess to clean up. It was all for the relatively low sum of $1,000, but he gave the men strict instructions not to harm his dogs. He even offered to provide the men with dog treats so that their dogs wouldn't alert anyone when he entered the apartment. Once law enforcement had what they needed, they arrested Cruz, who was charged with attempted murder and solicitation to commit murder. He would plead not guilty, but by October 2010, he pleaded no contest to the solicitation to commit murder, and the prosecution dropped the attempted murder charge. He was sentenced in December 2010 to 9 years in prison with the option of parole at 4.5 years. Later, it would come out in the media that Cruz was alleging that he wanted to hire the men because his wife had been very depressed following multiple failed fertility treatments. They had spent over $200,000 on the treatment and were out of options. After the last round didn't work, his wife is reported to have wanted to kill herself but couldn't do it for religious reasons. Cruz is alleged to have attempted to hire hitman as an act of mercy, so his wife didn't take her own life, though his story changed multiple times over the course of the investigation. During the trial, his wife could be seen in the courtroom. After the conviction and sentencing, Cruz was not talked about in the media again. It is believed that he's still married to his wife. He would have been eligible for parole in 2015 if he'd finished his whole sentence. He would have been released in 2019. What are your thoughts about this case? Let us know in the comment section down below. On April 16, 2004, Mike Danton, 24, was arrested for conspiracy to commit murder in a murder-for-hire plot that crossed state lines. Mike Danton, formerly Mike Jefferson, was a Canadian NFL hockey player. He was drafted in 2000 and was the 135th pick by the New Jersey Devils. He was ultimately traded to the St. Louis Blues, where he played his last game in the NFL. Danton was born and raised in Brampton, Ontario. He's said to have had a strained relationship with his family. He formed a close relationship with his coach, David Frost. Frost was also the coach of Sheldon Keefe, who the NFL would also draft in 1999, a year earlier. He would go on to become the head coach for the Toronto Maple Leafs. In his mid-30s in 2004, David Frost would become Danton and Keefe's agent within the NFL. Some were surprised by this because David Frost had been banned from several junior hockey leagues in Canada. He was accepted into the NFL Players Association as an agent. David Frost was very involved. Some would say he controlled what Danton could and couldn't do, making it so Danton had to come to Frost for every issue about his career. So what happened with Mike Danton? The FBI's order of events was that Mike Danton, while in the playoffs in San Jose, California against the San Jose Sharks, Mike Danton called a woman that he'd had a brief relationship with, Katie Wolfmeyer, asking if she knew anyone who could help him hire someone for $10,000 to have someone killed. Katie then got Danton in touch with her acquaintance, Justin Levi Jones. Some reports say that Jones was with Katie when she first got the call and offered to help unknown to both Katie and Danton. Jones was a law enforcement officer in St. Louis. Jones reported that plan to the authorities, who then set up a recording so that Jones could accept the hit. Danton would ask Jones to kill the person that was staying in his apartment in the next few days. Danton would say he was afraid for his life and that the person coming in was coming to hurt him. Jones was asked to make it look like a burglary gone wrong, and the person who was in the apartment at that time was David Frost. The FBI would stipulate that Danton had a fight with Frost over his behavior of drinking and partying, and that Danton was worried that Frost would tell the NFL team about it, so that he wanted to have Frost killed before he could. Frost would deny to the media that he was the intended target even today. Danton and Frost would have multiple phone conversations while Danton was in jail awaiting trial, until a judge banned communication between the two. The FBI had released some of these conversations. They would show a unique relationship between the two, including Frost telling Danton, "If you love me, you should say it," with Danton ending the phone call with "I love you." These phone conversations would bring some speculation of more of a relationship between the two, but it's never been confirmed. While awaiting trial, Danton lawyers had him evaluated by a psychologist. It is believed that they might have tried to mount an insanity defense, but in July 2004, Danton pleaded guilty to the federal conspiracy to commit murder. Because the phone call had crossed state lines, it was a federal case from the beginning. When he pleaded guilty, he said David Frost had been the intended target. Prosecutors allowed Danton to apply to be moved to a Canadian prison facility as he pleaded guilty. At that time, Danton's lawyers hoped to get him moved quickly because it was believed that they could get him better help in Canada, as that prison system had better counseling opportunities for inmates. Mike Danton was sentenced on November 9, 2004 to 7.5 years. In March 2009, after 5 years in federal prison, the United States Bureau of Prisons approved Mike Danton's transfer to a Canadian prison. On September 11, 2009, Mike Danton was released from prison on parole. Conditions of his parole include no face-to-face meetings with David Frost and no contact with his father. Katie Wolfmeyer was also arrested on the same charge of conspiracy to commit murder. Her case went to trial as she turned down a 2-year plea deal. She was eventually acquitted of all charges on September 2004. Mike Danton didn't testify at her trial. After being convicted, Mike Danton revealed that his intended target was his father. Danton said that he'd feared for his life around his father when he'd been abused by his father both physically and sexually. Mike Danton's father has denied this all and blames David Frost for his son's behavior and career downfall. There are multiple allegations against Frost for sexual harassment from other NFL and junior NFL players. He was charged in 2008 and went to trial but was acquitted in the end due to insufficient evidence. His systematic abuse appears to be an open secret in the NFL. According to sources, he has moved to the USA and works at a hockey academy in California under a new name. The FBI is adamant that David Frost was the intended target, but both Frost and Danton have stated multiple times since then that it had been his father. Mike Danton took a university course through correspondence. After Danton's release, he went to university in January 2010 at St. Mary's University in Halifax, Nova Scotia. There he joined the university hockey team, the Huskies, and played his first game since 2004 in January 2010. His team would win the Canadian University Cup that year. He would eventually return to professional hockey. He was drafted into a Swedish professional hockey league in 2011, and he played his last professional game on a Polish team in 2017. Mike Danton now lives in Halifax, Nova Scotia, and says that going to jail changed his life, that, quote, "I was in a pretty messed up state at the time, that's for sure, and it's big reason why I went for psychology in my undergrad, and now I'm working towards my major in sports psychology." He now runs the Mike Danton Hockey Academy and works with future hockey players. What are your thoughts about this case? Let us know in the comments section down below. On May 4th, 2001, 44-year-old Bonnie Lee Blakely was discovered to have been shot twice in her husband's car while he went to get something he'd left in the restaurant Fratello's in Los Angeles, California. The husband was famed actor Robert Blake, and the item he forgot at the restaurant was a handgun he'd alleged fell out of his pocket while dining. The restaurant was near the home he shared with his wife. Robert Blake was a well-known actor born in 1933. His first film credit was in 1939 working as a child actor. Born Michael James Vincenzo Gubitasi, the production company he worked for MGM suggested the name change to Bobby or Robert Blake. His most infamous role was the lead in a TV show called Barada and the 1967 movie In Cold Blood. Robert Blake would quickly be looked at with suspicion after his wife's death. Blake would tell police that he was not with his wife when she was shot because he'd returned to the restaurant to retrieve a gun that had fallen from his pocket. He told police he was carrying the weapon to protect his wife as she had a criminal past. Bonnie Lee Blakely was married to Robert Blake only 6 months after a paternity test proved that Blakely's daughter, who had initially been named Christian Shannon Brando, named because Blakely originally believed this child's father to be Christian Brando, son of famous actor Marlon Brando. After the test proved that Blake was the father, her name was changed to Rose Lenore Sophia Blake, and the two were wed shortly after. Robert Blake was Bonnie's 10th husband. Some of her marriages only lasted 1 day. 2 she'd met at a jazz club. She was reported to seek out older men, some famous, some for money. Her longest marriage was only 5 years. She had 4 children in total. After the shooting, information on who Bonnie was came to life. She was known to be a con woman who would put out ads in magazines, and if a man answered the ad, she would send provocative pictures of herself in hopes that they would reach out to her and she could convince them to give her money or even blackmail them. Some reports have said that she even used her eldest daughter to entrap men. Friends of Bonnie admitted that she was obsessed with celebrities, and she not only tried to become famous in her own right, but she'd do anything to marry a star. Some of her cons would get her arrested. In 1989, she was arrested on drug-related charges. In 1995, she was arrested for check fraud. And in 1998, she was arrested again for fraud, having possessed multiple driver's licenses and social security cards. She was sentenced to 3 years probation. She was still on probation when she met Robert Blake. Bonnie is alleged to have used men to get ahead and put herself in the limelight. So it was said that when she snagged a real Hollywood star and established actor with a storied career, it had been a dream come true. But the feeling wasn't shared with her new husband. Law enforcement revealed to the press that the gun Blake had left in the restaurant had been tested, and it was confirmed to have not been used to shoot Bonnie. However, on the day of the murder, Blake was tested for gunshot residue on his hands and clothes and tested positive. There were no witnesses to the crime. A busser from the restaurant would later contradict the account and say that there was no gun left at the restaurant when he cleared the table right after the couple had left. The murder weapon was discovered in a garbage dumpster near the crime scene with 1 bullet still in the chamber. It was noted as being an unusual vintage revolver. The gun wasn't registered to Blake, and law enforcement couldn't find a connection to any owner. Robert Blake's home was searched, with authorities finding similar ammunition to that used in the murder, and reported that 3 bullets were missing from the box. It took nearly a year for the prosecution to gather enough evidence, And in April 2002, Robert Blake was arrested at his sister's home. He'd been staying there with his daughter. He was charged with 2 counts of solicitation of murder and 1 count with special circumstances, which meant that the star could face the death penalty. Earl Caldwell, Blake's bodyguard, was also arrested and charged. Allegations that the star had asked 2 stunt performers that had formerly worked with Blake if they could kill his wife, reported having offered the men $10,000. Both men have stated that they refused the offer and testified at his trial. However, it was deemed suspicious that neither man went to law enforcement sooner with the information. Authorities believe that Robert Blake had killed his wife himself after he had tried and failed to hire someone to kill her. Blake is reported to have felt trapped in his marriage to Blakely and just wanted it to end. He had hired a private investigator to dig into Bonnie's past, and it was only then that he discovered Bonnie had continued her lonely heart scam even after they were married, which included sending nude photographs. It was later revealed that the two never lived together. Bonnie lived in a guest house on Blake's property, and the two shared custody of Rose. It was revealed that the couple had a tumultuous relationship, and I think that's kind of an understatement. Blake never truly trusted his new wife. Her pregnancy had been unexpected to say the least, and letters between the two revealed how they discussed at great lengths about what to do about the pregnancy. Though it wasn't just Robert Blake who had motive to murder Bonnie, she had swindled men across the country, some out of their entire life savings. After her murder, records were discovered in her home, meticulously detailed ledgers with who sent her money, when, and for how much. Friends of Bonnie revealed that her victims had often threatened her. They also stated that Bonnie had told them that Robert Blake threatened to kill her. She told her brother she thought that Robert might murder her. After Robert Blake was arrested, he spent almost a year behind bars before a bail was set at $1.5 million. He was kept on house arrest until the trial. Blake also paid the $1 million bond for his bodyguard. The trial started in December 2004 and lasted until March 2005. Blake was initially found not guilty of murder and one of the solicitations of murder charges. The second charge was dropped after the jury was deadlocked at 11-1 for acquittal. Blake's acquittal had left mixed feelings in the press. Some believed he was still guilty. Blakely's 3 oldest children filed a civil case against Robert Blake stating he was responsible for Bonnie's death. In November 2005, the civil jury found that Robert Blake was liable for the wrongful death of his wife. He was ordered to pay $30 million. In 2006, Blake filed for bankruptcy. He attempted to appeal the decision in 2007, in which the court upheld the verdict, but changed the awarded money to $15 million. In civil court, Earl Caldwell, Blake's bodyguard, was also acquitted and found not liable for the death. After the acquittal and bankruptcy, Blake maintained a low profile, only doing a few interviews now and again. In 2019, he started a YouTube channel called Robert Blake. I Ain't Dead Yet, so stay tuned. That same year would be the first time Rose would come forward to talk about her life since her mother's death. Rose had been 11 months old when her mother died, and since had lived with Blake's oldest daughter, Delilah. Rose didn't see her father after she turned 5, and in 2019 she visited her father for the first time since then. In an interview, she said to have talked about an interest in acting and knowing the truth about what happened to her mother. She didn't comment if she believed her father had done it. After all the legal fees and civil judgments paid, Robert Blake was broke. He lived off his Social Security and the Screen Actor Guild's pension for the rest of his life. In March 2023, Robert Blake died at the age of 89 of heart disease. Bonnie Lee Bakley's murder remains unsolved. What are your thoughts about this case? Let us know in the comment section down below. Before we proceed, I've got an exciting surprise for you. We've launched a brand new channel dedicated to intriguing content such as old historical mysteries, cold cases, and particularly chilling horror stories perfect for bedtime. Drop a comment letting us know if you're a fan of horror stories or not. You can find the link in the description below. Let's find out who will be the first to explore it. Alright, let's dive back into the video. It was on Monday, February 2nd, 1987, when Maria Pacheco took her newborn son, Elias Monroy Jr., for a routine checkup at the LAUSC Medical Center in Los Angeles. Elias was only 2 weeks old and was born happy and healthy, but it had been a difficult delivery for Maria. Maria was still recovering from a cesarean section and was experiencing a lot of pain, which was making it difficult to walk and get around. While in the clinic waiting room, Maria was approached by a woman in her 30s, who said she was a mother as well. The two chatted for a bit, and Maria thought the woman was friendly and honest. So when Elias started to cry, Maria dug through her diaper bag, but realized she didn't bring enough bottles. The woman offered to hold Elias while she went to look for some formula, and Maria accepted. Maria had only been gone for a few minutes. When she returned, she noticed the woman was gone, and so was her son. At first, it was thought that the woman had simply gone into her appointment and had taken the newborn with her, but no one matching her description was identified as a patient there or had an appointment. Little Elias had been kidnapped. When detectives started investigating the abduction, detectives in Asperia, California reached out with a similar abduction attempt on January 14th. In that case, a woman who had similarities to the description of the LA abductor approached a woman in a post office who was with her 4-month-old son. This woman had started chatting with the mother and had asked to hold the baby, which the mother declined. She left the post office and continued running her errands. Later on in the day, she arrived at a Safeway. She parked and was unbuckling her son from the car seat when she noticed the woman from the post office barreling towards her. The woman was screaming, "I want the baby, I want the baby," and tried to rip the little boy from his mother's arms. And it was then that she noticed that there was a man with the woman this time. The mother kicked at the woman, knocking her back. Then the man tried to take the child from her arms and she kicked him as well, getting him between the legs, and she ran with her child into the grocery store. She was helped by the store employees, but the two child abductors ran off. By the time law enforcement arrived, they were long gone. The woman was described as Hispanic, 30 to 35 years old, around 5 feet 7 inches and 150 pounds. Both said that she had a dark complexion, and Maria said that the woman had long brown hair, but the ends were frosted blonde. The mother didn't get a good look at the man, and there wasn't a description of him. Unfortunately, there are no photographs of Elias, but a new age progression image has been generated to show what he may look like today. Elias is Hispanic with brown hair and brown eyes. At the time of his abduction, he weighed 8 pounds and was 1 foot 9 inches long. He would be 36 years old today and is believed he was abducted by a woman to be raised as her own. He may still be in the California area. He may believe he was adopted as a child. Maria put out a plea out to social media saying, quote, "Elias, look for me, communicate with me. I am your mom and you were my dream come true, but someone took you from me." The National Center for Missing and Exploited Children is very hopeful in identifying Elias and reuniting him with his family. Anyone who recognizes Elias from the age progression image or the sketch of the abductor is asked to contact the LAPD. What are your thoughts about this case? Let us know in the comment section down below. It was on April 5, 1975, when 2-year-old Christopher Bush was left unattended in a vehicle at a grocery store parking lot in the Germantown neighborhood of Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. He had been left in the care of a babysitter, 26-year-old Patricia Warwick, at the time and had been with her for 2 weeks prior following a fire that destroyed the Bush home. Christopher's mother, Gwendolyn, was staying with relatives with her 3 other children, while they found a new home that would accommodate all of the children again. When Patricia returned to the 1966 maroon Ford station wagon after shopping, she discovered that Christopher wasn't there. All that was left was the hat that he'd been wearing. She searched the surrounding area but found no sign of the toddler, finally calling the police an hour later. Precious time had been lost and the investigation turned up little information. Over 100 officers searched for days, but nothing came up. Patricia swore that she had left the car doors locked. There was no sign of a break-in. However, someone could have easily convinced Christopher to unlock the door. Car seats weren't mandatory in the US until 1986, so it's likely that he was just sitting in the back seat. Alternatively, she might have forgotten to check all the doors of the car. Either way, someone got in. Patricia claimed that she had only been in the store for 10 minutes before coming back to the vehicle. so the window for the abduction was relatively short. Christopher Bush is described at the time of his abduction as a black male, 2'10" and 40 pounds. He was wearing a denim jacket with a white fur-trimmed collar and a light blue corduroy pants. He was born in 1973 and may have been adopted out in 1975. The case remains unsolved and there's been little movement in the case since 1975, though there are hopes that he will be found and reunited with his family. Christopher would have been 50 years old today and may have grown up in the Pennsylvania area. What are your thoughts about this case? Let us know in the comment section down below. It was on April 27, 1974, when 5-year-old Cynthia Lynn Sumter was playing outside on the front lawn of the apartment building she lived in with her mother in San Jose, California. Cynthia's mother, Linda, left around noon to pick up sandwiches for lunch. But while she was gone, she asked a neighbor to watch her daughter. When she returned about an hour later, Cynthia hadn't come in for lunch yet. She looked outside but couldn't see her out front. For 30 minutes she searched by herself but opted to call the police, who gathered a 50-person search party to look for the little girl. Dozens of leads came in, but it appeared that the girl had vanished without a trace. One lead from a witness stated that they saw a little girl matching Cynthia's description in a blue car driven by a young man with blonde hair and a mustache. However, this sighting was never confirmed by a secondary witness, so it's hard to know if this was a credible sighting. That she needed to drop the criminal charge against his brother to see Cynthia again, along with $1,000 cash. 5 weeks before the abduction, Cynthia had been molested by a boy who lived next door. Linda had pressed criminal charges. It was determined that the boys didn't have Cynthia and were charged with attempted extortion. Cynthia's parents had divorced a year earlier, and in the early days of the investigation, both accused the other of kidnapping the child. Both were investigated and asked to take polygraph tests, which they both passed. They were ultimately ruled out as suspects. Another suspect was Antonio Madrid, a neighbor who lived 100 yards from the apartment building. Madrid committed suicide 2 days after the abduction. Law enforcement later found a shirt with blood on it and blonde hairs in his vehicle. His unclear genetic testing had been done on those items. Convicted killer Eugene Joseph Wesley was also investigated about Cynthia's disappearance. While connected to a polygraph machine, it showed deception, leading detectives to believe he knew more than he was saying. However, law enforcement stopped investigating him when he died in prison. At the time of her disappearance, Cynthia is wearing a red and white striped tank top with a blue star on the front and purple pants. She was barefoot. She is described as white, with blonde hair and blue eyes. She has a cowluck on the right side of her hairline and a mole on the left side of her neck and shin. Her nickname is Cindy, and she often went by both Cindy or Cynthia. Linda believes Cynthia is still alive. A body was never found, nor any evidence that would point to the contrary. In a statement to the media, she said, quote, "I pray every day that God will bring her back into my life sometime here on this earth, not just in heaven, that I can hold her one more time and tell her how much I loved her." The San Jose Police Department is hopeful in solving the cold case and is asking anyone with information to come forward, as without it, the case will likely go unsolved. In a statement to the media, they said, quote, "Even after this many years, someone out there has information that can be helpful to the San Jose Police. We won't close this case until she is physically found." What are your thoughts about this case? Let us know in the comment section down below. It was on September 20th, 1991, on Staten Island, New York, when the body of a woman was discovered in a patch of weeds along a dirt road. The woman had been handcuffed, severely beaten with a hammer, and strangled to death. Her body was then set ablaze. The murder weapon was found under her body with the name Lloyd L. carved into the handle. The woman remained unidentified for 3 decades, known for all those years as Jane Doe with the scorpion tattoo. The cold case was opened in 2023 when familial DNA gave her name back as Christine Belusco. Christine was 30 years old at the time of her murder. She had been a missing person since September 13, 1991, when she was last seen by family members. Christine had recently learned that she was adopted and had a falling out with her parents, who hadn't told her about the adoption until she was an adult. It had been a shock to Christine, and she told her family she was moving to Florida. That was the last she had been seen. Her family had no idea she'd been dead all these years. Her brother was the one to receive the notice that Christine had been identified as a Jane Doe. He asked if they had also found Krista. It was only then that law enforcement learned that Christine had a child who'd been with her at the last time she'd been seen. Her daughter had only been 2 at the time. Krista Nicole Belusco was last seen with her mother the Mount Airy Lodge in Mount Pinocho, Pennsylvania. Her family never knew who her father was. Law enforcement believe that finding Christine's killer will lead to finding Krista. They believe that Christine was killed by someone she knew and are hoping that finding the identity of Krista's father will point them in the right direction. Krista Nicole will be 33 years old today. Her birthday was August 1st, 1989. She is described as Caucasian with brown hair and brown eyes. What are your thoughts about this case? Let us know in the comment section down below. Dean Corll, known as the Candyman, was born on December 24, 1939, in Fort Wayne, Indiana. He had a tough childhood, feeling lonely and caught in fights between his parents who eventually got divorced. Corll worked in the family candy business for years, and it's where he came to terms with being gay. However, his personal life turned darker over time. Between 1970 and 1973, he killed at least 28 people, though some believe the actual number could be higher. It is possible that all the bodies could not be found. But according to the available evidence, all of his victims were males aged 13 to 20, the majority of them in their mid-teens. Most of the victims were abducted from Houston Heights, which was then a low-income neighborhood northwest of downtown Houston. With most abductions, he was assisted by one or both of his teenage accomplices, David Owen Brooks and Elmer Wayne Henley. Several victims were friends of one or both of Corll's accomplices. Others were individuals with whom Corll had himself become acquainted prior to their abduction and murder. And 2 other victims, Billy Balch and Gregory Malley-Winkle, were former employees of the Corll Candy Company. Corll's victims were usually lured into either one of the 2 vehicles that he owned, or a 1969 Chevrolet Corvette that he is known to have purchased. The enticement was usually an offer of a party or a lift, and the victim would be driven to Corll's house. Once there, the youth would be given alcohol or other drugs until they passed out, tricked into donning handcuffs or simply grabbed by force. They were then stripped naked and tied to either Corll's bed or usually a plywood torture board which was regularly hung on a wall. Once manacled, the victims would be sexually assaulted, beaten, tortured, and sometimes after several days killed by strangulation or shooting with a .22 caliber pistol. Their bodies were then tied in plastic sheeting and buried in discreet locations nearby. In several instances, Corll forced his victims to either phone or write to their parents with explanations for their absence in an effort to soothe any of the parents' fears for their son's safety. He is also known to have retained keepsakes, usually keys, from his victims. He was often referred to as the Candyman or the Pied Piper, due to his connection to his family firm, the Corll Candy Company. He was said to have a habit of handing out free candy to kids. And later on, this turned out to be horrifyingly similar to his habit of enticing young men with special treats to trust him, right up to the point where they were captured, tortured, and murdered by the Candyman. Dean Corll died in 1973 after a violent dispute and shooting incident after bleeding out from gunshot wounds inflicted by one of his own accomplices, Elmer Wayne Henley. In his case, there were no legal proceedings since his case was discovered post-mortem. All of the details in the police records were revealed by Henley, other accomplices, and the family members of past victims. Corll was so good at concealing his true nature throughout his life that he remains a mysterious figure to this day. Although Dean Corll was never captured alive and never diagnosed with any mental illness or known conditions, some of his actions seem to indicate the characteristics of a dissociative identity disorder. For example, when he was around his family, army friends, or in any other conventional social situation, he appeared normal and well-adjusted, which means he took some effort to conceal the other side of him around them. Around his right-hand men, meaning his known accomplices and his criminal associates, he could show the crazy and violent side of his personality, and did so frequently, and often enough to disturb even other hardened criminals. The media a 2003 film named Freak Out was loosely inspired by the Houston mass murders committed by Coral. The film was directed by Brad Jones, who also starred as Coral. This film largely focuses upon the last night of Coral's life prior to Henley shooting him and contacting authorities. What do you think about it? Tell us your thoughts in comments below. Let's continue. Before we proceed, I've got an exciting surprise for you. We've launched a brand new channel dedicated to intriguing content such as old historical mysteries, cold cases, and particularly chilling horror stories perfect for bedtime. Drop a comment letting us know if you're a fan of horror stories or not. You can find the link in the description below. Let's find out who will be the first to explore it. Alright, let's dive back into the video. Richard Ramirez, also known as the Night Stalker, was born on February 29, 1960, in El Paso, Texas. His dad was abusive and struggled with alcoholism, making home life terrifying for Richard, his mom, and siblings. Sadly, Richard was influenced by his older cousin Miguel Mike Ramirez, who was a war hero but also had a troubling past as a serial killer and rapist during his time in Vietnam. Miguel used to show the young Richard Polaroid pictures of the multiple Vietnamese women who were his own targets. These graphic images of war crimes showed the women to be raped, dismembered, and murdered. Richard was fascinated rather than repulsed. Subsequently, his own highly publicized home invasion and murder spree across the greater Los Angeles area, and later the San Francisco Bay Area over the course of 14 months, featured a wide variety of weapons and different murder methods. These included handguns, various types of knives, a machete, a tire iron, and a claw hammer. Richard Ramirez was known to attack by punching, pistol whipping, and strangling many of his victims, both manually with his hands and in one instance a ligature. He stomped at least one victim to death in her sleep and tortured another victim by shocking her with a live electrical cord. Ramirez apparently enjoyed degrading and humiliating his victims, especially those who survived his attacks or whom he explicitly decided not to kill by forcing them to say that they loved Satan, or telling them to swear on Satan if they wanted to live. It was during this period of intense terror that he inflicted on California residential communities that he became known as the Night Stalker in the national press. And on August 30th, 1985, Ramirez was recognized by members of the public as El Matador, or literally the killer, due to his prominence in news media reporting. A crowd of people chased him down in the street near Boyle Heights in LA and nearly beat him to death before police arrived. In 1989, Ramirez was convicted of 13 counts of murder, 5 attempted murders, 11 sexual assaults, and 14 burglaries, and sentenced to death in California's gas chamber. After filing multiple appeals, Ramirez was transferred for medical treatment of complications secondary to B-cell lymphoma to Marin General Hospital in Green Bay, California. He died there in 2013 without ever expressing any remorse for his actions. Psych profile psychiatrist Michael H. Stone describes Ramirez as a made psychopath as opposed to a born psychopath. This implies that the abuse and bad experiences he was subjected to at an early age and the unstable way he was raised led him to think that certain actions were normal, as that was the only norm he knew of. However, with the loss of his moral compass, Ramirez began to build up his own desire with the patterns of his killing and this new public spotlight he never had before, as he was being portrayed as a terrifying, anonymous celebrity predator. Actually encouraged him to execute more people as a means of gaining more attention. Media Richard Ramirez has been portrayed many times in the mass media due to the intensely scrutinized nature of his case. There are many movies and documentaries about him, including 2 depictions of him in the most recently. There was a 2021 documentary released by Netflix called Night Stalker, The Hunt for a Serial Killer, which features first-person interviews, archival footage, newly shot reenactments, and original photography related to the case. What do you think about it? Tell us your thoughts in comments below. Let's continue. Before we continue, 90% of you haven't subscribed to our channel, so if you like this video, please subscribe. It motivates us to make more content for you. Okay, let's continue. H. Holmes, the torture Dr. Herman Webster Mudgett, better known as Dr. Henry Howard Holmes or H. Holmes, was born on May 16, 1861, in Gilmanton, New Hampshire. He came from a modest farming family who were descendants of the original English immigrants to the area, and also happened to be devout Methodists. As a young man, Mudgett trained as a surgeon from the University of Michigan. So how did this man end up becoming known as America's first serial killer? Due to unreliable reporting and an era of great superstition, there was a lot of sensationalization and misinformation about this case for decades. Initially, reports by the yellow press, the supermarket tabloids of the time, often emphasized the existence of Holmes' murder castle, which was supposed to contain secret torture chambers, trapdoors, and a gas chambers and a basement crematorium, but all of this was subsequently disproved. Holmes did have a history of selling cadavers to medical schools. However, he acquired his wares through grave robbing rather than murder. Other accounts claim that the building was made up of over 100 rooms and laid out like a maze, with doors opening into brick walls, windowless rooms, and dead-end staircases. In reality, the hotel floor was moderately sized and largely unremarkable. It did contain some hidden rooms, but they were used for hiding furniture that Holmes bought on credit and did not intend to pay for. The verifiable facts are that Holmes was sentenced to death for only one murder, that of his former accomplice and business partner, Benjamin Pitezel. It is believed that he killed 3 of Benjamin Pitezel's children, as well as 3 women he was engaged in sexual relationships with, the child of one of the said mistresses and the sister of another. Unlike most other serial killers, Holmes usually had a rational motive for his series of murders, usually for financial reasons or to prevent his own exposure and punishment. The grisly details along the way are what really elevates this case to the top tier of the annals of American horror. He apparently used a range of methods, using poison, chloroform, gas, and suspected bludgeoning. He hid the bodies pretty cleverly, in cellars and backyards. He constructed elaborate and overly emotional cover stories to dupe his unsuspecting victims. Several of his endeavors were actually financial fraud and misdemeanor crimes. So as a talented con man and grifter, he himself was able to confuse the details of his exact crimes thoroughly. Historians now say that it was his own talent for tall tales, deception, and duplicity that led to his public reputation as America's first serial killer. On the other hand, he really did use some killing methods known only to medical professionals of the time. So the other title of the torture doctor is perhaps more appropriate for him. Holmes was executed in 1896. Before he died, he succeeded in thoroughly confusing the police, press, and public with wild and contradictory confessions of his own crimes. In some cases, he confessed to the murder of people who were verifiably still alive. At one point, he claimed to be possessed by Satan, which makes about as much sense as anything else that we know about him. Although this case largely predates the introduction of mental health evaluations into the United States criminal justice system, later generations of psychiatrists believe that Holmes may have been almost entirely unique in that he was psychopathic, extremely intelligent, charismatic enough to fool most others, creative in his various MOs, and prolific in his killing strategies. A study from Concordia University, St. Paul, he posits that Holmes was a predator who viewed others as a means to his ends. His personality structure resembled that of a true psychopath, a remorseless and narcissistic person who controls others and lies repeatedly. All of this while being glib and charming. There have been multiple books and depictions of Holmes in popular media across the last century. A few of the most famous are the 2006 episode of the U.S. television drama series Supernatural, where the ghost of H.H. Holmes returns to kidnap people. In 2017, the History Channel aired an 8-episode limited docu-series entitled American Ripper, in which Holmes grilled Jeff Mudgett, along with former CIA analyst that Holmes was also the infamous London serial killer Jack the Ripper. And as of 2019, an adaptation of Holmes' life called The Devil in the White City, with Martin Scorsese and Leonardo DiCaprio attached as executive producers, was said to be in development with Paramount TV and Hulu. This production appears to be in hiatus for now, but may well be revived later according to industry reports. What do you think about it? Tell us your thoughts in comments below. Let's continue. Ed Gain, the butcher of Plainfield. Edward Theodore Gain was born on August 27, 1906 in La Crosse, Wisconsin. His father was an alcoholic and largely unemployed, while his mother was a bitter and bigoted religious fanatic. In between the drinking and the excessive Bible reading, Gain may have ended up with what a child psychiatrist today might call trauma triggers or PTSD. Later in life, he became obsessed with accounts of cannibals and Nazis in pulp fiction magazines, showing a tendency to enjoy a very specific kind of violence. His heavy emotional attachment to his mother may have badly affected his social development and even caused him to murder his own brother Henry, which was later referred to by his biographers as the Cain and Abel aspect of his case. After his mother's death, his mental instability spiraled. His other crimes included the murder and grave robbing of middle-aged women, who resembled his mother, as his intention was apparently to create some kind of a woman's suit so he could crawl into the skin of these women and become his own mother resurrected. A police search of his home after his capture, following a particularly brutal murder, that of a neighboring female of around the right age, revealed among other evidence a disturbing diagram of the human adult female as a deceased work in progress. The evidence included whole human bones and fragments, a wastebasket made of human skin covering several chair seats, skulls on his bedposts, some female skulls with the top sawn off, bowls made from human skulls, a corset made from a female torso, skinned from shoulders to waist, leggings made from human leg skin, and masks made from the skin of female heads. Gain apparently made a great deal of headway in constructing either a new woman, Frankenstein assembly style, or reconstructing his dead mother before he was captured. Gain could not stand trial due to his clear mental incompetence and was instead confined to a mental health facility. Later on, he was judged competent to stand trial, where he was found guilty of murder, but also pronounced legally insane and consequently remanded to a psychiatric institution. He died at Mendota Mental Health Institute in 1984. Psych profile Gain was diagnosed as having been a schizophrenic as well as a sexual psychopath. His mental illness stemmed from his love-hate relationship towards women, which later turned into a full-scale psychosis. Gain was a necrophiliac, as body parts excited him sexually, though he denied ever actually having sex with the dead bodies that he murdered or exhumed from graveyards on the grounds that they smelled too bad. Media Gain is actually the most famous serial killer on this list, though not necessarily under his own name. Due to the very specific and darkly grotesque nature of his crimes, Gain was the inspiration for several fictional serial killers, including Norman Bates, the killer from the movie Psycho by Alfred Hitchcock, Leatherface, a skin-wearing killer from the Texas Chainsaw Massacre, and Jamie Gum, aka Buffalo Bill, a serial killer in The Silence of the Lambs. What do you think about it? Tell us your thoughts in comments below. Let's continue. Eileen Wuornos. Monster Eileen Lee Carol Wuornos was born February 29, 1956 in Rochester, Michigan. Her father was a convicted child molester who later killed himself in prison. Wuornos' mother abandoned her and her brother when they were young, leaving them with her parents. Wuornos' grandparents and their children. Wuornos' grandfather beat her, and her grandmother was an alcoholic. Eileen Wuornos became a teenage runaway, a prostitute, pickpocket, and regular thief from pawn shops. Later on, as an adult, her record included, among other felonies and misdemeanors, arrests for illegal possession of a firearm, forgery, assault, and robbery. Her associates and law enforcement personnel would often describe her as erratic, and easily her arrest records frequently noted that her attitude was poor. From late 1989 through late 1990, the bodies of 7 middle-aged white men were discovered in Central Florida. Eileen Wuornos had robbed all of the victims before shooting them to death and stealing their cars. Of all the other serial killers on this list, Eileen Wuornos is verifiably the most consistent, effective, and deadly killer of the group. As far as we know, she never left any survivors. Her victims were all of the same specific age and ethnic grouping in roughly the same area or highway territory. And the MO or modus operandi that she used was so similar in every case that as of today, Wuornos is considered a textbook case of a classic serial killer, repeating her murders with regular and pinpoint accuracy. Her victims included Richard Mallory, who was shot multiple times in the chest; David Spears, who was shot 6 times in the torso; Charles Carskaden, who was shot 9 times in the chest and stomach; Troy Burris, who died of 2 gunshots to the torso; Charles Dick Humphreys, who suffered multiple gunshots to the head and torso; Walter Antonio, who was shot 4 times in the back and head. In an interesting side note, the FBI profiler Robert K. Ressler briefly mentioned Eileen Wuornos and his autobiographical history of his 20 years with the FBI. Writing in 1992, He said he often does not discuss female serial killers because they tend to kill in sprees instead of in a sequential fashion. He said Warnos was the sole exception known to him at the time. Her methods were successful enough that she might have evaded capture indefinitely if her girlfriend Tyria Moore hadn't snitched on Warnos to the FBI to avoid her own criminal charges on complicity in the murders. Eileen Warnos was executed in 2002 in Florida after 12 years of imprisonment on death row. Psych profile. According to the psychopath checklist, Warnos was found to have a strongly psychopathic personality with a score of 32. The cutoff score for psychopath is 30 out of 40 in the United States. Warnos was also diagnosed with other issues in prison, and it was officially determined that she had both borderline personality disorder and antisocial personality disorder. As America's most famous female serial killer, Warnos is a celebrity in her own right and was intensively discussed and represented in the media. But her biggest moment in the spotlight came when she was portrayed by the South African origin Hollywood star Charlize Theron in the movie Monster, released in 2003. Warnos was reportedly disgusted with what she saw as her exploitation by the media without her permission, though she could hardly claim any copyright violation of her crimes against humanity. Theron, on the other hand, went on to win the Oscar for Best Actress for her stellar performance. What do you think about it? Tell us your thoughts in comments below. Let's continue. Thug Behram, Yellow Handkerchief serial killer. The darkest and quietest hour of India's late 18th century nights became the deadliest nightmare for people. Many knew that travelers who were on the roads during the night disappeared without a trace. But unfortunately, no one was sure what had happened to them. That fear drove travelers to stick together, seeking safety. But that was precisely what the thugs wanted. And no one knows how many people met their end this way. This is the story of the Yellow Handkerchief serial killer. Tracing back to the historic roots of serial homicide, roughly between the mid-1600s and the mid-1800s, travelers in India had an unshakable fear. Roads were unsafe, and the Coits reigned supreme across the main provinces of the subcontinent at that time. The poor reputation of the unsafe roads were a driving force in creating an atmosphere of horror and fear among the people for centuries. It was during this time when a shy and silent kid, born in 1765, would turn into one of the biggest threats to the common people in 18th century India, and his name was Behram. A 25-year-old gangster named Saeed Amir Ali had met Behram at some point in his life and trained the kid to become a thug. Behram started to attack and murder people when he was just 10. By the time he himself was 25, he had engaged himself in the world of robberies and assassinations. Behram eventually became the leader of the gangs that murdered and looted the travelers on the roads across the subcontinent. They were a gang of over 200 thugs who worshipped Kali, the Hindu goddess of death. Behram and his companions felt that they had to make sacrifices to please their goddess so that they could prevent the world from being destroyed. Years in the life of crime made Behram and the gang pretty clever in their work. These men would resemble the physical appearance of the traveler, wearing turbans and carrying some luggage. And their idea was to loot a lot without getting caught. Sometimes the gang even used poison that would induce drowsiness, making it easy for them to loot their victims. While they were there in the jungle before attacking the men on the roads, the gang members would communicate by imitating the jackal's cry. They also kept different code languages, including a word called Ramos, which they used before assaulting their victims. Once they determined a person to loot, these men divided themselves into 3 groups. One group would hold the victim's feet down, another group would hold the head down, and the third would do the final murdering. Finally, they would wrap a cloth around the victim's neck and strangle him to death. Now we mention the victims as a he in particular because the gang avoided murdering women and children. After all, it was a sacrifice to their deity who was a goddess. Now the moment they robbed the men they had slain, it was no longer for their goddess. It was more to fulfill Thug Behram's unquenchable thirst than for any deity or goddess. So he started to commit murders to quench his own bloodthirst. But wait, how could a yellow handkerchief be the cause of death? Well, Behram was an exceptionally gifted strangler, so his weapon of choice for murdering was a yellow handkerchief. But it doesn't sound too deadly compared to a large knife or gun, does it? Maybe that's why Behram would have turned the handkerchief into a clever murder weapon. Thug Bahram employed the same way of murdering his victims almost every single time. He was said to strangle his victims to death using his handkerchief and a medallion. He could throw this medallion around the victim's Adam's apple, which allowed him to strangle people with deadly force. After that, he disposed of the remains in wells. He would have murdered at least 150 people in this manner. But he witnessed many more murders taking place right in front of his eyes. During his initial days of crime, Bahram was also accompanied by a female thug named Dolly, but later on both were separated. Bahram gave new meaning to words like brutality, thugs, and notorious. People throughout central India had heard about the disappearances that occurred regularly, and eventually it attracted the attention of the British authorities. They reacted to these unexplained incidents by assigning detectives to find out what was happening. Of course, Bahram murdered these detectives, but not before they discovered that a guy named Thug Bahram existed. The British didn't expect to find the detectives dead, and so the British sent a man into India who entirely changed the face of gangsterism in the nation. This man is almost single-handedly responsible for curbing organized crime in 18th century British India. He announced that any thug who agreed to be an informant for them would have been granted immunity. When authorities met people and informed them about this immunity, Sleeman had got a lead about said Amir Ali's location. Finally, the Britishers reached his house, but by then said had escaped from there. But his mother and other family members were arrested by the Britishers promptly. For the sake of his family, in 1832, said Amir Ali surrendered, and after many inquiries, he gave clear information about Bahram to the Britishers. After a couple of years, Bahram and his gang were finally captured in 1838. After the arrest, Bahram revealed that he, along with his group members, had killed nearly help of yellow handkerchiefs and medallions, of which Bahram personally murdered 150. After narrating the stories of his crimes, the other members of his group were also arrested by the Britishers. Finally, in 1838, he was hung at a tree at Jabalpur, Madhya Pradesh. Sleeman gave a concession to Bahram's new gang members by sending all of them to the Jabalpur's reformatory. People in central India were so relieved by what transpired afterward that they named a town near Jabalpur after Sleeman, named Sleemanbad. Simply put, Thug Bahram's and his people's narrative is yet another tale of human sacrifice taken to an extreme, all in the name of religion. Bahram was the leader of the Thuggee cult, which has its name in the Guinness Book of World Records for its 931 victims. And arrestingly, all of the gold, silver, and precious stones he stole and buried have not been recovered yet. The location of his priceless loot remains a mystery. What do you think about it? Tell us your thoughts in comments below. Let's continue. Before we proceed, I've got an exciting surprise for you. We've launched a brand new channel dedicated to intriguing content such as old historical mysteries, cold cases, and particularly chilling horror stories perfect for bedtime. Drop a comment letting us know if you're a fan of horror stories or not. You can find the link in the description below. Let's find out who will be the first to explore it. Alright, let's dive back into the video. Raman Raghav, India's Jack the Ripper. Mumbai, also known as Bombay, was the city that never sleeps, but it had once been put to bed early. The slum dwellers and people who didn't hesitate to sleep on the pavement were once made to go into hiding. Bombay police, who captured the underworld by the throat, once fell short of hands to piece this puzzle together. All because there was once a mystified man from Tirunel Valley, Tamil Nadu, who had served 5 years in prison for assaulting his sister and stabbing her to death. The man had become a nightmare for people who inhabited the land of dreams and hopes. This is the story of India's Jack the Ripper. Some call him Sindhi Dalway, while a few call him Talway. For some, he was Anna, and for the rest, he was Velaswamy. Was Raghav Raman. He was born in 1929 in the Tirunel Valley district of Tamil Nadu. He didn't complete his schooling because of indulging in crimes at a young age. However, his crimes didn't stop there. He assaulted his sister and stabbed her to death with multiple knife wounds, for which he served 5 years in prison. After that, nobody knew where Raghav went or where he lived, until he set foot in Bombay. To know his entire story, we need to go back to the times when Mumbai was Bombay. Holding an umbrella in the streets to protect himself from the unpredictable Bombay rains, A well-groomed man with neatly combed hair spreading the faint fragrance of coconut oil appeared a bit obsessive by looking into the mirror that he carried every few minutes. But except for these appearances, Raghav wasn't an ordinary man in Bombay. It happened during the late 60s. The delicate bright mornings in Bombay made people notice the dead bodies that had started piling up in their vicinities. But nobody knew how. It was evident that dwellers near slums, pavement residents, stray animals, or anybody without a suitable home were the potential targets. But no one knew that Raghav did this or that he even existed. Only in the silence of the nights, when the streetlights and suspicions were low, Raghav would come out from the woods to look for anything that moved, so that he would hammer the life out of them. To him, humans weren't humans. They were things that he could smash and crush with blunt objects. He used a regular steel rod to beat human faces, crack their heads, and break their skulls. He also used various handmade weapons to assault as many as 19 people along the Central Railway line between 1965 and 1966. Some were beaten to death, but others lived to tell the terrifying story of a small-statured guy. One such eyewitness who reported the incident to the local police was Kritika. She was a relative of one of the victims. She was the one who gave descriptions of the man who beat his victims to death. And Raghav seemed to be a homeless guy who matched the eyewitness's description. So he was summoned. But owing to a lack of proof, Raghav was deported back to the streets. After that, he wasn't suspected. His murder stopped for a while, but the peace was temporary. When the dead began to pile up again in 1968, the investigators were at a loss for how to put this puzzle together. This time, the displeasure of this unknown murderer was felt by more than a dozen victims. Owing to that, Bombay residents were again placed under lockdown. Rumors began to circulate regarding the serial killer's superhuman abilities, and the nightlife of Bombay was overwhelmed with fear. Around the same time, the case was handed over to the Deputy Commissioner of Police, Ramakant Kulkarni. Ramakant, like the rest of the police department, was confused as he went through the files. Nobody knew where to start or where to conclude their hunt. Therefore, it was impractical and nearly impossible to conduct a citywide search because no one knew who they were searching for. So the citywide search was ruled out. While hunting for leads, DCP Kulkarni began documenting the locations of the murders. They found a followed pattern similar to the 1965 to 1966 homicides. The victims were frequently hacked to death near the jungle shadows. And before 1965, it was along the Central Railway line, near the eastern suburbs. And during 1968, it was in the northern suburbs. This remark attracted Kulkarni's interest, and he began looking through Raghav's papers, suspecting Raghav of being involved in the series of murders. Kulkarni issued a warning to his force to keep an eye out for Raghav and bring him in for interrogation. Sub-Inspector Alex Philo was one among the cops who were called in and given Raghav's files and records. Neither cops nor the victims believed that this man would put an end to the cold-blooded of India's Jack the Ripper. A police manhunt involving 2,000 officers was underway around the city. Every member of the task team was handed a photo of Raghav. They conducted an intense hunt in every nook and corner of the city. His photograph was published in the press and a request for assistance and information. It was a gigantic mission in a massive metropolis, and that's precisely what he did. When Vilaljo was waiting at a bus stop in South Bombay, he noticed a person was carrying a wet umbrella, but it was not raining there, which raised the suspicions of the sub-inspector. Vilaljo didn't know what made him look at the individual, but he found this man in khaki shorts and a long blue shirt walking in his direction. He asked the man where he was coming from, and he replied, "Place in the western suburbs where the murders had happened." It strengthened his doubt since the man was walking in the wrong direction from that place. The man was also carrying half-rimmed spectacles and a thimble that resembled a particular tailor who was murdered in Malad a couple of days ago. The sub-inspector put the puzzles together, and finally, Philo arrested Raghav in front of a handful of credible witnesses. Raghav's things comprised commonplace objects, including spectacles, 2 combs, a pair of scissors, a stand for lighting incense, soap, garlic, tea dust, and 2 pieces of paper with mathematical figures. His clothing was blood-stained, and his fingerprints matched those on the dead victims. Finally, Raman Raghav was convicted. The police were able to put a face to the 40-plus murders for the first time. Raman's story, however, did not finish there. His confession was as mysterious as the murders that he had carried out. Raman refused to answer any questions for weeks following his arrest. His lips were locked regardless of whether he was being beaten or punished. Out of all the tactics in the book, a chicken dish was the one that made Raman talk. He asked the cops for having the chicken curry after his arrest. After weeks of questioning, the cops decided to agree with his request. After completing his entire chicken curry meal, Raman told the police to ask him whatever questions they wanted. Before the cops knew all they wanted, they had to fulfill a few more wishes, though. But finally, Raghav admitted to murdering 41 people. Following his confession, he accompanied the police on a citywide tour to show them the locations where he worked, and to retrieve the rod he had hidden in the northern suburbs. Raghav was sentenced to death for his crime, but his defense argued that he was mentally incapable of making conscious judgments and did not realize his actions were illegal. Raghav was referred to a special medical board of 3 psychiatrists by the Bombay High Court due to this. When a panel of doctors examined him at the directive of the High Court, they found that he would never be cured of his kidney failure as well. So the High Court reduced his sentence to life imprisonment in their judgment on August 4, 1987. He was lodged at Yerwada Central Jail in Pune. He was also under treatment at the Central Institute of Mental Health and Research. In 1995, Raghav died at Sassoon Hospital due to kidney failure. It has been decades since these incidents have happened, and yet Raman Raghav remains as India's Jack the Ripper. What do you think about it? Tell us your thoughts in comments below. Let's continue. Renuka Shinde and Seema Gavit, the first women in India to receive the death sentence. The story of Renuka Shinde and Seema Gavit is a famous example of how parenting can go drastically wrong. And these two sisters gave the term heartless a whole new meaning. This is the story of the first women in India to be hanged for their heinous crimes. One who puts their kids above their own selfish needs and wants. It's not a job, it's a choice. But meet Anhanyabai, who neither considered parenting a gift nor a responsibility. She was an exceptional mother who ruined the entire lifetime of her daughters, besides destroying many other kids' lives. There wouldn't have been any story about Renuka Shinde and Seema Gavit if Anna didn't enter the play. Yes, it all began with Anna. She had no life skills other than pickpocketing and grabbing jewelry in busy areas. It was how she managed to get by for so many years. But one day, this cold-eyed criminal was arrested for 125 petty theft cases, including pickpocketing and snatching people's gold chains from around their necks at railway stations. She said that she had become a thief only after her first husband, a truck driver, deserted her after the birth of Renuka. She then married Mohan Gavit and they had a daughter, Seema Gavit. But indeed, at a point after their marriage, Mohan became sick of having continual conflict with the cops for petty thievery because Anna had roughly so many cases filed against her. Mohan hoped that getting Renuka married would at least make Anna understand her responsibilities. So, in 1989, they married Renuka to Kiran Shinde, who was working as a tailor near Shirdi. But even after Renuka's marriage, Anna didn't change. Instead, she started to ruin Renuka's life by leading her into petty crimes. Not being able to tolerate Anna's activities in 1990, Mohan divorced her and left Seema with her. He then got married to a lady named Pratibha. Mohan knew that Hannah was extremely angered because of the marriage, but little did he know about the influence of Hannah over Renuka and Seema. What began as a revenge strategy for Mohan leaving, Hannah quickly turned it into manic kidnappings for her selfish gain. Neither Hannah nor her daughters could forget Mohan leaving them. Though Hannah did these petty crimes for her living, she couldn't let Mohan live a happy life with his wife. So, in November 1996, Anna, along with her daughters, Renuka and Seema, planned to kidnap and murder Mohan's 9-year-old daughter, Kranti, and they succeeded in that plan. Mohan and Pratibha reported their kid's disappearance. They both were sure that only Anna and her daughters could do this to Kranti. The inspectors assigned to the investigation confirmed their suspicions as well. The search team was sent to their house in Nashik. They uncovered evidence of more kidnapping, including discarded clothing of Kranti, confirming that they had murdered her. They also found a mysterious presence of several children in photos of Renuka's children's birthday party celebrations. They didn't seem to be locals. Nasic police quickly figured out that the 3 women were a pickpocketing gang, also involved in petty crimes. But who were the children? The investigation of the children's identity led them to find that Kranti wasn't the only one they murdered. Chatursringi Temple, a famous religious place in Pune, was where the actual story of Renuka Shinde and Seema Mohan Gavit took a sinister turn. And Renuka's son Sudhir was the catalyst for their initiative in these crimes. It was 1990. One day the 3 women went with Renuka's son Sudhir to a temple. The first time when the trio had gotten into some trouble. Besides being a kid, Sudhir had attempted to pickpocket someone, which turned the eyes of the crowd towards Renuka and Sudhir. But she turned her child into a shield, telling the crowd that a mother with a kid would never steal. These words from the mother made the angry crowd stay calm, and finally the crowd let them go. This incident made Anhana take a child with them whenever the group committed a robbery. Instead of Renuka's kids, they chose newborns and young children from busy areas like temples or marketplaces. Then, when they finished their thefts, or if the infant opened its mouth and made any sound, they would either leave or murder the child. Their first victim was Santosh, who was just 18 months old. Renuka kidnapped him from a female beggar in Kohalpur. The trio took him to Kohalpur and went to a temple. When Seema tried to snatch a wallet and was caught by the male victim, he began beating her, and Hannah deliberately threw Santos to the ground to create a distraction. Unfortunately, the child sustained a head injury due to her monstrous acts. The crowd empathized with the kid's cry and consoled the trio, so their theft went unreported to the police. The trio then moved on to a bus stop and stole 3 more purses with injured Santosh. They didn't even care to offer first aid to the kid. Due to his bleeding head wound, the poor kid continued to cry. Ahna decided the boy was of no further use and might attract the attention of the police. So she mercilessly struck him with an iron pole until he was dead, and then washed her clothes of blood. They took his body to a rickshaw stand and disposed of it, fleeing back to their hostel. This was only the start of their horrible actions. They kidnapped dozens of kids between 1990 and 1996, and then discarded them when they had served their purpose. The majority of them were beaten to death, their skulls smashed in, or thrown down flights of stairs, among other things. In 1991, they kidnapped 9-month-old Naresh, who was starved and beaten to death because he cried too much, while an 18-month-old Bhavna was bundled into a handbag and left in a cinema's restroom. In 1993, the trio abducted a 1-year-old child named Buntai and a 2-year-old girl Swati from Kalyan railway station in Mumbai and a 2-year-old boy, Gudu, from another Mumbai station. 3 women murdered Bunty and Guru and disposed of their bodies. In 1994, they kidnapped another 2-year-old kid named Anjali and Nashik. They murdered her and disposed of the body. Kiran, Renuka Shinde's husband, had no other choice than to help the trio dispose of the body. In 1995, they kidnapped a boy named Raja from a bus stop in Kohalpur and murdered him as well. They kidnapped Pankaj Mamankar, age 4. When they found that the boy was talking to the passers-by about his parents, the ladies killed him by hanging him upside down from a ceiling and slamming his skull against a wall. That was in 1996. According to Kerwin Shinde, these ladies were ruthless and had no guilt for their actions, and authorities linked the photographs to the slew of kidnappings and murders involving children in Kohalpur, Nashik, and Pune districts to the trio of the sisters and their mother. All of them, including Kiran Shinde, were arrested. Despite this, Kiran received a pardon in exchange for collaborating with the authorities and providing all of the information they needed. Seema Govind was just 25 and Renuka Shinde was 29 during their arrest in 1996. While Anana died of sickness shortly after her arrest, the other 2 were found guilty of murdering 5 children and abducting 13 children. Despite filing a mercy petition in 2014, which India's former president Pranab Mukherjee denied, the sisters are presently on execution row. In reviewing the mercy appeal brought by half-sisters, the Bombay High Court postponed its judgment on December 23, 2021. Bombay High Court commuted the half-sister's execution sentence to life imprisonment on January 18, 2022. What do you think about it? Tell us your thoughts in comments below. Let's continue. K.D. Kapima, India's first convicted female serial killer. Over a time period of 3 months, 5 women were discovered dead on the outskirts of Bangalore. There were no marks on their bodies and no sexual or physical violence evidence. Cops were confused until the autopsy entered the play. According to the victim's autopsy report, cyanide was in their system. Who do you suspect committed these assassinations? What may be the reason behind this? Most people imagine a male with wrong reasons as the murderer of these women. But you would be wrong. Yes, this is the story of India's first convicted female serial killer. The mastermind behind the cyanide was K.D. Kapima, also known as Cyanide Malika. Here's the story of how she got her name. Female serial killer. She is accused of being responsible for the deaths of 6 women in the state of Karnataka between 1998 and 2007. After her first murder, she is thought to have taken a 7-year sabbatical. The fact that a woman murdered these victims astonished the investigating authorities for a long time, thanks to chauvinistic mentalities. This isn't a scary story by any means. Actually, on the contrary, this is a narrative of greed and ambition. It is the story of a humble lady who was so ambitious that nothing could stand in her way, not even human lives. Born in 1970, Kagali Pura Kapima and her family lived in the suburbs of Bangalore. They were a simple family leading an everyday life like most other families in the village. Kapima was always ambitious. She had always been attracted to a more lavish lifestyle. She always thought of pursuing the quickest path to her goals. Her ambitions never changed even after she grew. When she was a teenager, Kapima married a tailor and became a mother soon after. She had 2 more children after that. However, Kapima was dissatisfied with life's offerings. She wanted more and much more. She served as a house helper in the place that she was born. Yet her earnings didn't satisfy her. So, Kapima decided to become wealthy overnight and began stealing from the homes where she worked as a helper. Following this, she decided to establish a chit fund near her house to assist her in achieving her objectives, which she finally accomplished. However, as a result, the chit funds experienced significant losses because of Kapima. This resulted in the family of 5 being buried in debt. Kapima's husband threw her out of the house in a rage. In 1998, he deserted her. She was forced to search for new sources to create money after losing her business. While she was looking for a source of money, she found cheating ladies in distress to be the easiest. She eventually found work at a jewel shop after working as a helper for a period of time. However, it too did not work out in the end. Her employment at the jewel shop, on the other hand, was not in vain. She also had discovered a one-way ticket to wealth in the shape of cyanide. Kapima claims that she learned about cyanide and its usage as a poison from the movies that she viewed. However, while cyanide was a copied notion, the remainder of the method was unique. So Kapima came up with a great murderous plan to get wealthy in only a few days. And her plan was to capture ladies visiting the temple. Every day, Kapima would visit the temple to keep a closer eye on what was there. She remained focused on the regulars, who appeared to be in a lot of discomfort. When the timing was perfect, she would approach them as holy women and listen to their troubles. She would be well aware of their distress and desires. She would say that she decided to help them out by performing a ritual which would fix all of their issues. She would also ask them to wear the most valuable clothes and jewelry to the ritual. Kapima would frequently invite them to a temple on the outskirts of town that they had never visited before. After that, she'd ask them to close their eyes and pray. They had no clue that it would be their final blink of the eye. Then she'd bring them holy water, which was cyanide-laced water, and that was her modus operandi for all of her victims. Cyanide Malika's first victim was a 30-year-old rich woman, Mamata Rajan, living on the outskirts of Bengaluru in 1999. After that, Kapima's attention was pulled to precious goods regularly. In the month of October 2007, Elizabeth became her second victim. Elizabeth was a woman who was on the search for her missing granddaughter. Kepama called her to Kabalama Temple, performed her ritual, and murdered her. Her third victim was 60-year-old Yashad Amma, who suffered from asthma. In December of 2007, with the promise of curing the same, Kepama brought her to Siddhaganga and murdered her. Muniyama was Kepama's fourth target, who wished to be a devotional singer. Unfortunately, she was murdered at a temple in Yadair, a short distance from Bangalore. Kepama's fifth victim, Yashad Amma, was killed in a car accident. Palama was a priest at a temple in Hebel. Kabama promised her that she would sponsor the building of a new arch for the temple and murdered Palama at a temple close to Manja. The sixth and final victim of Cyanid Malika was a poor, childless woman who only wanted a son. Her name was Nagveni and she was murdered in her sleep. Kabama was caught and arrested on December 31, 2008, at a bus stop in an attempt to sell the jewelry that she had taken off of her victims. Unfortunately, many other jewels belonging to her other victims were also found. She was eventually given the death penalty for her murders, which was later commuted to a life sentence. While Kepama was convicted for the cold-blooded murders of these 6 women, it is believed that she may have killed other women too. This might have included a young woman called Renuka, wanted to give birth to a son but could not. The profile fit Kepama's modus operandi, but this was not proven. A few other women had also gone missing, some of whose bodies were found in 2009 and further connected to Kepama. Her victims were older ladies going through difficult moments in their lives, and Kepama would take on a new identity after each murder. She was first arrested by Baidati police in 2001. She tried to rob jewelry from a house where she went to perform a ritual. Kepama was taken to the interrogation there, but the relatives found her and she was rescued. She, however, was sentenced to 6 months in jail for her crime. As a result, she was released after 6 months of imprisonment. After her first murder, Kepama was reported to have gone 7 years without getting engaged in another. There are claims that she murdered many people during this period. This also remains a mystery. She admitted to her crimes when the police arrested her, but this was not the end, as Kabama was again convicted for multiple murders. She was consecutively given the death sentence in 2010 and 2012 for the murders of Miriama and Nagvini respectively. But her punishment for Nagvini's death was commuted to a life in prison, as only circumstantial evidence was found against her. Kepama became the first woman to be given the death penalty in Karnataka. In 2017, Kepama again hit the headlines when she became the jailmate of VK Sashikala, a confidant of late Supremo J. Jailasha. It was alleged that Kepama tried to meet Sashikala several times, due to which she was shifted to another jail, as she posed a threat to Sashikala. Malika cyanide is still a mystery. Although we sometimes try to rationalize murders by looking back in time to identify anything that went horrifically wrong during the killer's formative years, Cyanid Malika's early life provides no such clues, as there is little to no information about that period. The circumstances surrounding the killings, on the other hand, lead us to think that she was motivated entirely by financial gain. However, Cyanid Malika remains to be India's first convicted female serial killer. What do you think about it? Tell us your thoughts in comments below. Let's continue.